Senator Corr.
Honourable colleagues, I rise today on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation to speak to Senator Klein's inquiry number 13, highlighting the business and economic contributions of Indigenous businesses to Canada's economy. As Senator Klein has said, there are many valuable lessons to be learned and built upon for continued success towards accelerating the participation of Indigenous people in Canada's economy. Colleagues, at our Senate Standing Committee on Indigenous People, we've been completing our study on Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation. We know, colleagues, that before contact with colonizers, Indigenous peoples had thriving economies, communities, and governance structures, and that colonization and assimilation in all their forms suppressed that prosperity and that strength. Supporting Indigenous prosperity by advancing economic reconciliation is key to meeting several of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Equitable access to education, employment, and economic opportunities for Indigenous people is essential. And of course, those efforts must be led by Indigenous people themselves. The new National Council for Reconciliation will, among other responsibilities, monitor progress on reconciliation across Canada in all sectors, including economic reconciliations. However, this monitoring responsibility may not be so easy to accomplish. In its paper released earlier this month entitled An Overview of the Indigenous Economy, the Bank of Canada pointed out that there are about 1.8 million people self-identified as Indigenous, representing 5% of the Canadian population. Of this total, there are 1.05 million from more than 630 First Nations, with approximately 30% of First Nations people living on reserve and 70% living off reserve. There are 624,000 Métis people and 70,500 Inuit people, with close to 70% of the Inuit people living in the Inuit Nunangat, where they are the majority population. Almost 60% of the Indigenous population in Canada lives in rural areas, compared to 1/3 of the non-Indigenous population. And 1/4 of the Indigenous people live in Canada's 12 largest cities. The Bank of Canada paper says the attempts to measure the size and contributions of the Indigenous economy in Canada are limited by data availability and quality. Despite these gaps in data, some studies, however, have attempted to quantify the size or contributions of the Indigenous economy. While the estimates vary considerably, they suggest that the share of gross domestic product, GDP, of Indigenous people is well short of half of their population share, which speaks to the economic disparity that exists between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations of Canada. Colleagues, half, 50%, is quite a significant gap. Is this discouraging? Yes. Is this unacceptable? Yes, definitely. But now, colleagues, let me turn to some examples of efforts being made to close that prosperity gap. Today, as we come closer to the end of Mi'kmaq History Month, I would like to highlight two incredible stories of economic leadership from Mi'kma'ki, the place I have the good fortune to inhabit, a story about Membertou and one about Buktinkeq. Let me start with the success story of Membertou First Nation, a well-known economic powerhouse on Cape Breton Island. You heard me mention it last week in my statement honoring Dr. Sister Dorothy Moore. And as many of you likely know, our former colleague, the Honourable Dan Christmas, has played a central role in that success of his nation. I would first like to share the most recent chapter in that story by reading the words of Chief Terry Paul, and I will mention a 1977 Diploma in Leadership graduate of the Coady International Institute, where I used to work. In a letter written in November 2020 to his community, he wrote, and I quote directly from Chief Terry, he wrote, "Dear Membertou, I'm incredibly proud to announce that Membertou has led a major commercial acquisition that will have lasting positive impacts on our community for 7 generations to come. As of today, Clearwater Seafoods has been acquired by a Mi'kmaq coalition, which includes Membertou and our new business partner, BC-based Premium Brands. Clearwater is one of the largest fully integrated seafood companies in North America and is now owned by the Mi'kmaq. A truly monumental day for our people. The details of this commercial, he went on to say, the details of this commercial acquisition include Membertou and a coalition of participating Mi'kmaq communities from across Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, owning 50% of Clearwater Seafoods and 100% of Clearwater licenses. For 13,000 years, the Mi'kmaq have sustainably fished the waters of Atlantic Canada, and today, on this truly transformational day, we are owners of a global leader in the fishery. For so many years, our communities were not welcome to participate in big industry. Today, on our own terms, we are 50% commercial owners. All benefits of ownership will flow back to our community, and with a seat at that table comes the ability to influence the role of our people in the commercial fishery. Please understand, he says, that this commercial acquisition is separate from both our moderate livelihood, rights-based fishery, and our commercial inshore fishery operations. With today's news, we are participants in all sectors of the fishery. Chief Terry goes on and says, through working with our partners at First Nations Finance Authority, the Collective of Communities has financed $250 million over 30 years. This investment is unique and separate from our current commercial operation and does not financially impact Membertou's ability to continue providing all the services necessary for our growing community in any way. In fact, it creates a brand new revenue stream for us, diversifying our financial portfolio and creating wealth for Membertou for many years to come. Today, as he concludes, he says, we are keeping our hero, Donald Marshall Jr., in our hearts. It's a moment we know he would look on with great pride. Walalio, Chief Terry Paul. And proud all members of Membertou First Nation should be. This is huge. It builds on decades of forward-thinking and painstaking smart economic development efforts by Chief Terry, Dan Christmas, and other Membertou First Nation leaders. From establishing the Membertou Development Corporation in 1989 to becoming the first ISO 9001 certified Indigenous community in the world, to being voted the best managed company in Canada. As Chief Terry says, we used to be looked at as the backwoods. Now we're seen as uptown. In addition to Clearwater Seafood and their other fisheries, Membertou has a trade and convention center, a data center, a geomatics company, a boat building company. It's involved in gaming and entertainment, a sports and wellness center, and they're involved in commercial real estate. They have a stake in a planned wind-powered green hydrogen initiative and big plans for much more. Colleagues, Membertou is often cited as a success story for other communities to emulate. Now, colleagues, the second Mi'kmaq community economic development success story comes from the First Nation just down the road from where I live, Buktunkek First Nation, where our new colleague, Senator Prosper, was chief for 7 years before he became regional chief for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Colleagues, last Wednesday evening, on opposite coasts of our country, economic development in Buktunkek was being celebrated. On the East Coast, in Antigonish, for the first time ever, a Mi'kmaq business, Buktunkek's Bayside Travel Center, won the Antigonish Chamber of Commerce Emerging Business Award. On the West Coast, at the Westin Bayshore Hotel Vancouver, Rose Paul, CEO of Buktunkek's Bayside Development Corporation, was being presented with the National Indigenous Women in Leadership Award by the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. The citation for her award said, do I keep going? Okay, said, and I quote the citation, Rose has been the trailblazer for business development, negotiations, and partnerships as leader of the business arm of Buktunkek Mi'kmaq Nation. That commitment has fueled a vision to maximize future employment and business development for Buktunkek community members. Rose and her leadership team worked to develop the first ever tripartite agreement with provincial and federal governments and was awarded a multi-million-dollar highway interchange site at exit 38B on the Trans-Canada Highway, and with land that the community was separated from a 1960 breach of agreement. Rose has built a strategy for economic strides and developing strategic partnerships, reclaiming spaces at decision and planning tables, creating partnerships corporately through economic reconciliation. An essential element of the community's long-term economic vision are strategic partnerships with corporate stakeholders such as Industry Leader and first of its kind in Nova Scotia, Everwind Fuels. It's an alliance that Rose says will drive them towards energy sovereignty and becoming a net zero contributor on the fight against global warming. Rose Paul credits Senator Prosper as a great leader who rolled up his sleeve with her on economic prosperity efforts in Buckton-Keck. I first met Rose Paul when she participated in the Coady International Institute's Indigenous Women in Community Leadership Program. She's gone on to complete an MBA at Cape Breton University and recently completed an executive leadership program at Harvard. When I sat down with Rose at Bayside a couple of weeks ago, she told me the story of how, since she took up her economic development leadership role in 2006, that reclaiming that land on the other side of the highways was a community priority and key to its future prosperity. In addition to its new state-of-the-art Bayside Travel Center, which has a large gas station, 2 restaurants, a convenience store, a liquor store, a gift shop, a Nova Scotia tourism facility, gaming, and a long-haul trucking facility, the site provides a base for so much more. Buckton-Keck also has Bayside Renewables, where they are involved in solar farms and are planning the only integrated microgrid in Atlantic Canada, which will combine solar panels, battery storage, and EV charging right on that site. Like Member 2, Buckton-Keck has a stake in Clearwater Seafoods. They have an equity position and are at the table with Everwind Energy, a green hydrogen initiative. They're involved with Maritime Launch, Canada's first commercial spaceport in Canso, and they have plans for a new business centre and a hotel. When I asked Rose about the impacts of all this economic activity on the community, she told me that social assistance rates are down 30%. More people are employed, and it's a real paradigm shift, a real mind shift for young people who now see themselves pursuing business opportunities or being employed right there in their own community. Rose said these successes are long overdue and so important to fulfill the promise of those who came before her, like her own grandmother, to make it right by them, to honor their hard work and their vision. Honourable colleagues, I'm just so impressed with CEO Rose Paul and Chief Terry Paul and the Mi'kmaq Nations of Member 2 and Buckton-Keck. These leaders and these communities, like their peers that we're hearing about across Canada, are working hard and creatively every day to close that wide prosperity gap discussed earlier. And they're both doing it with a clear focus on fulfilling the visions of their ancestors and with a steadfast effort to create economic opportunities and a healthy, prosperous future for generations of young people to come. Honourable Senators, please join me in congratulating Chief Terry Paul and CEO Rose Paul on their leadership and their many accomplishments. Walalio, thank you. Merci.